Why me don't have no prejudice about myself? My father's a white and my mother black. No, them call me half caste or whatever.
Spinning like a dervish, his long dreadlocks twirling wildly, the Wailers pumping out their irresistible dance rhythms behind him. The sight of Bob Marley playing live on stages across the world graphically brought reggae, the Jamaican version of rock music, to an international audience spanning all cultures. The Wailers' sound buzzed with the rebellious spirit of the ghetto, their illustrious leader's personality and beliefs forged in the pressure cooker environment of the Government Yards housing scheme of Trenchtown in West Kingston. As a teenager, Bob Marley became the self-styled Tough Gong, a fearless, rude boy who cut a swathe amongst the many street gangs that ruled the neighbourhoods of the inner city. He loved Shantytown and intrinsically understood its spirit. Later, it was to become the inspiration for many of his classic songs that articulated the hopes and fears of his fellow sufferers there. And yet the singer was born far away from these violent, overcrowded areas of Jamaica's capital. Robert Nesta Marley came into the world at 2:30 on the morning of the 6th of February 1945. Born in the village of 9 Miles in the parish of St Anne's in the north of the island, Marley spent his early childhood safe in this rural farming community under the watchful eye of his mother, Cedella Siddy Marley, and his maternal grandfather, Omariah Malcolm. At the age of just 18, Siddy had been made pregnant by a 50-year-old white quartermaster, Captain Norval Marley, who was part of the British West Indian Regiment. Siddy and the captain were married, but separated soon after the ceremony. The young black woman remained with her people in St Anne's, whilst Norval went back to Kingston. Although slavery had been abolished more than a century before, the British would preside over the island until independence in the summer of 1962. The black population, meanwhile, had developed its own culture, forging stronger ties to its African ancestry than to the customs foisted upon it by the British. The rural community especially was rooted in the law of the Dark Continent, and superstition was as commonplace as more Christian beliefs. There was, for example, a strong fascination with the warding off of evil spirits, or duppies as they called them, with potions and prayers. At a very young age, Nesta, as his family preferred to call him, revealed he had his own special powers and shocked inhabitants of the parish, like the local policeman, when he could uncannily see into their pasts and predict their futures. Captain Marley put pressure on Siddy to have access to his son, arguing that he should come to Kingston where the education system was superior. So, barely 5 years old, the lad was packed off on the bus to stay with his father. Although Norval collected Nesta from the depot in Kingston, within weeks the community in 9 Miles realised he'd gone missing and that neither his nor his father's whereabouts were known. Country folk were suspicious of the city and its labyrinthine streets, and Siddy spent an agonising year waiting for news of her lost child. Finally, a relative came across him in Trenchtown, where he was lodging with an elderly woman, Miss Gray. Siddy brought the boy home, and he quickly settled back into the rural life, apparently none the worse for his experience. He attended the local Stepney school and forged his first friendships, becoming close to one child in particular, Neville Bunny Livingston, son of a local carpenter, Toddy Livingston, who'd become enamoured of Nesta's mother. But when Omariah, Siddy's father, remarried, she got itchy feet and decided to move away. Although city life could be hell, it did present opportunities, and she had thoughts of eventual emigration to England or the USA. So Toddy and Siddy moved to Trenchtown, where Toddy ran a rum bar and did stonemasonry on the side. Nesta and Bunny joined their respective parents when Nesta was 10. Soon after their arrival, Siddy and Norval were formally divorced. The Englishman had bigamously remarried without consulting her, and it was at the hearing that Nesta was to see his natural father for the last time. As they walked away from the court, the boy commented to his mother that neither of them needed the captain anyway.
The more you accept herbs, the more you accept Rastafari. You dig what I say? We who accept herbs Herb is not, herb is important, but herb is more important to the people who don't accept it yet because that is the reality. I mean, it's not it's something that you crave, but you check it in your sense and say, herb.
Life on the streets of Trenchtown was cheap. Everywhere there was the smell of defeat, and violence was the common currency. Jamaica as a whole seethed with political unrest. Whilst his mother never took to it and eventually would relocate to Wilmington, Delaware in the US to start a new life, Nestor took to his new existence like a rude boy to a ratchet, the name for the long-bladed knife popular with teenage gangs. Though he was small of stature, he quickly gained a reputation as a feisty street brawler. Yet, if the truth be known, he always preferred a good game of football to a scrap. He became a skillful player, and it was a sport that he would continue to play well into his adult life. Even as a rock star, he would organise daily games, often in the company of his mate and national team star, Alan "Skilly" Cole. It was no wonder his friends referred to him as the Skipper. Siddy had expected her son to join the ranks of the semi-skilled at age 15 and become a welder, but he had other ideas. He and Bunny were crazy about music. They spent all their time singing together while Bunny strummed a homemade guitar. Listening to their prized transistor radio, the teenagers would pick up sounds from American stations and warm to singers like Ray Charles, Fats Domino, Brenton Wood, and vocal acts like the Drifters and later the Impressions. Jamaica also had its own indigenous popular street music, ska. This was but the latest development in a growing line of musical styles that had emanated from the Caribbean. First, there was calypso, which had spread like wildfire from its origins in Trinidad. Then there was a craze for steel pan music. The mento folk beat had come next, absorbing African elements. By the time young Nestor and his generation were eating up the rocking rhythms of New Orleans, the collective imagination of Jamaican youth was ignited by the sound systems that were arriving on the streets of the capital. These in turn popularised ska with its heavy backbeat and accompanying dance craze. Marley, now using the shortened version of his first Christian name, was desperate to make it as a singer. At the suggestion of soon-to-be famous fellow vocalist Desmond Dekker, he approached local producer Leslie Kong about recording him. In 1962, Bob cut a number of self-penned songs for the Chinese Jamaican, including One More Cup of Coffee and Judge Not, which was his first single on the Beverly's label. It may have been no great shakes, his voice reedy and high, but it did reveal that Bob's songwriting already had a spiritual undertone. However, Marley and Kong would eventually fall out when the latter refused to pay him for a session. It was during this period that fate lent a hand in deciding Marley's future path. An accident in a welding shop left the would-be singer temporarily blinded and made him resolve to follow his heart's desire, whatever his mother might say. He was already taking lessons from Rastafarian father figure Joe Higgs, who tutored local youths in the art of singing. Bunny was another willing pupil, as was one Winston Hubert McIntosh, who'd soon shorten his name to Peter Tosh and join his pals to form the Wailers. Junior Braithwaite, Beverly Kelso and Cherry Smith completed the lineup, and at the end of 1963, they'd enjoy their first hit single, Simmer Down. Released as Bob Marley and the Wailers, the tune spent the first 2 months of 1964 as the #1 hit on the Jamaican Broadcasting Radio chart. Released by Sir Coxsone Dodd and his Studio One company, the group would record over 30 numbers for this self-styled king of the city sound systems over the next 3 years. Though they varied widely in style, the band's tough, rude boy stance and social concerns always found embodiment in the music. Lineup changes invariably occurred, and for a while Bob considered a permanent move to the USA following in his mother's footsteps. However, in 1965, he met a nurse and sometime vocalist, Rita Anderson. Rita sang in a group called the Soulettes, which had been signed by Dodd and passed to Marley to develop. A romance ensued, and the two were married on the 10th of February 1966, just prior to a trip Bob had planned to visit Siddy in Delaware. Though a regular Christian, Rita was fascinated by the burgeoning religious cult of Rastafarianism. Many ascribed its roots to the Jamaican-born black militant Marcus Garvey, who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association earlier in the century. Its motto of one God, one aim, one destiny called for a new state in Africa for the dispossessed black peoples of the world to return to. Garvey was a follower of the Holy Bible, which claimed to be the closest thing to the first Bible and believed that a new Christ-like figure would emerge to deliver his people. When Ras Teferi Makonnen was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930 and claimed lineage back to the sons of Solomon and Sheba, Garveyites took this as a sign of the Second Coming, and the cult of Rastafarianism was born. The Ethiopian emperor took the new name of Haile Selassie, and his disciples practiced a strict code of behaviour. For instance, they followed a diet of specially prepared etal food. They were not allowed to cut their hair and grew it out in long rope-like strands referred to as dreadlocks. Women were expected to take a totally subservient role to men, and perhaps most significantly, they smoked marijuana or ganja as a holy sacrament. This highly illegal act was to lead them into constant conflict with the authorities. Bob initially left Rita behind in Jamaica. Ostensibly in America to finance his singing career, Bob had a strange dream that was to trouble him for many years to come. In it, he received a ring from a man in a fedora hat. Rita, meanwhile, experienced her own epiphany. Haile Selassie had come on a state visit to Jamaica, and Rita witnessed his motorcade leaving the airport. As the emperor waved to her, she saw that his hand was marked in such a way to suggest he had a crucifixion scar like the one Christ had received when nailed to the cross. At that moment, the seeds of her devotion to the Rastafarian movement were sown. Her husband's conversion would soon follow suit.
Why one race want to be rich and the other one be poor? Why one want to fight on the other? There's no more of that. The youth of today say no.
Although Rita joined him in the States, any long-term plans to live there were scotched in the autumn of 1966 when Bob was sent his draft card to fight for Uncle Sam in the Vietnam War. With a little money under his belt, Marley went back to Jamaica and to his music with renewed enthusiasm. Rock steady had come in, a slowed-down, more sensual version of ska, with more emphasis on the drums and bass. Bob initially didn't like it. He'd written a batch of new songs in America which he recorded with Peter and Bunny, some for Cox and Dodd, and some for their own Wayland Soul M label, named after the band and Rita's old vocal outfit respectively. One such number was Bend Down Low, a local smash in late '67. Sadly, it was so extensively bootlegged that the band saw no profits from it. It was a period of harassment for the band, with all three members spending time behind bars, Bunny suffering an especially long stretch for possession of marijuana. It was also a time of spiritual enlightenment for Bob, as his involvement with Rastafarianism grew through his talks with his old mentor, Joe Higgs, and with Rasta elder, Mortimo Plano, who took him to Grau Nation ceremonies where Rastas met to feast, chant and meditate whilst smoking the good herb. It was through Plano that Bob met American-born singer Johnny Nash and his manager Danny Sims. Nash, best remembered for I Can See Clearly Now, would enjoy a British chart hit with Marley's Stir It Up in 1972. The Wailers with Rita recorded some more of Bob's songs for Sims' Jad label, though the latter felt that Marley should put all his energies into his songwriting and forget about singing. The singer also mended the fence with Leslie Kong and cut some rock-steady sides for the entrepreneur. Following another short stint of work in the States in a car plant, Marley began a collaboration which would have a profound impact on the development of Jamaican roots music. At the end of the 60s, reggae began to emerge. The term had first been coined by Toots and the Maytals on their 1968 single Do the Reggae. It had a nagging, ragged rhythm. Marley claimed the term derived from the Spanish expression for the king's music. Outside of Jamaica, the 60s revolution was in full swing, and Bob's key influences at this time were two American rock musicians, Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone, who were dragging black music in new and exciting directions. Into this equation stepped local producer Lee Scratch Perry, who literally psychedelicized emergent reggae. Perry was, and remains, a one-off, regarded by many, none more so than Marley, as a genius. Volatile and visionary in equal measure, Scratch knocked the Wailers into shape, turning them into a lean, mean machine. He didn't like horns, told the band to ditch its falsetto harmony vocals, and he was responsible for Marley's voice assuming its natural, more plaintive tone. Perry gave the nagging rhythm guitar centre stage and added surreal edges to the mixes with echo and distortion. The work the Wailers did with Perry during this period is regarded as a creative high point. The chemistry between them palpable on songs like Small Axe and Duppy Conqueror. Credit was also due to Perry's band, The Upsetters. Indeed, Marley was so impressed by the talents of the rhythm section, bassist Aston Family Man Barrett and his younger brother, drummer Carlton, that he asked them to join the Wailers, much to Scratch's displeasure. Never a man to put all his eggs in one basket, Marley continued to work for Sims, which led to him flying to Sweden to work with Johnny Nash on a soundtrack for a film, Love Is Not a Game. Though no music emerged, Marley met a young white keyboard player, John Rabbit Bundrick, who'd later work with top bands like Free and The Who. They both wound up in London, backing up Nash on his debut solo album. Sims landed Bob a contract with CBS, though only one single, Reggae on Broadway, emerged. Sims also brought in the other Wailers for a tour of the UK, but it didn't amount to much. A date at the Speakeasy Club in London and some gigs in secondary schools in the Midlands. When Sims and Nash suddenly disappeared off to Miami on business, the Wailers found themselves penniless and stranded in the gloomy, cold UK. Help was at hand, however, from an unexpected source.
The lyrics of the songs, majority is fighting against the oppression.
Fate intervened when Brent Clark was brought in to promote Reggae on Broadway, and he put the band in touch with Chris Blackwell at Island Records. In 1972, Island was synonymous with the best in British rock, boasting a roster that included Traffic, Roxy Music, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Nick Drake and Cat Stevens. Blackwell was already aware of the Wailers. The son of a wealthy white Jamaican family, he'd started the label in 1959, naming it after Alec War's novel Island in the Sun. As a young teenager, he and some friends had got lost on a boating trip. Stranded, Blackwell set off to find help and wandered into a Rasta fishing village. Scared by stories he'd heard of these people, he was impressed by the kindness with which he was treated, and the experience was one he would never forget. In 1962, he relocated to London, licensing and distributing product from Jamaican producers. In 1964, he struck gold when Millie Small had a huge hit with the ska-influenced novelty tune My Boy Lollipop. Later, he would co-run Trojan, which put out material by many leading Jamaican labels, including recordings owned by the likes of Cox and Dodd and Leslie Kong. In doing so, he gave the Wailers their first UK releases. The Island boss had heard that the Wailers were a difficult bunch, but at their first meeting, both Blackwell and Marley felt a mutual respect for each other, which would grow over the next decade. Blackwell gave the group an unprecedented deal for a reggae band at that time. As well as buying Bob out of his CBS contract, he gave the Wailers £4,000, which was big money in those days, to record an album in Jamaica, and said that he would match that with a further £4,000 on its completion. He also agreed to license material the band was issuing on its recently set up Tough Gong label. The Wailers returned to Kingston and got straight down to work at Harry J's studio. The lineup augmented by Tyrone Downey on organ and Rita and her friend Marcia Griffiths on backing vocals. After further sessions, the master tapes were couriered back to London, where Blackwell added a final couple of twists to make it more palatable to a white British audience. He had Rabbit overdub keyboards, and Muscle Shoals session man Wayne Perkins contributed some crucial rock and roll guitar licks to 3 of the numbers. Blackwell was determined that this album, now titled Catch a Fire, would break into the white market. Reggae and its antecedents had very much been singles orientated, and Blackwell wanted to get it out to the lucrative album's audience. To this end, he spared no expense on the lavish packaging. The sleeve was designed as a giant cardboard reproduction of a Zippo cigarette lighter. It certainly struck a chord with that generation of British record buyers brought up on the record cover as a work of art mentality of the late 1960s, early 70s. But would the music contained inside it do the same? Marley would later comment that it was an introduction and that nobody yet knew who the Wailers were outside of their homeland. It was for people to get into and listen. Uncompromising, it was like nothing else the public had heard in 1973. The hard, skanking rhythms, suffused with elements of blues, soul, rock and funk, married to themes of social injustice and black militancy on songs like Concrete Jungle and Stir It Up, cut it apart from the pack, in a scene dominated by soft Californian rock and British progressive music. Initially, it wasn't a huge seller, but the band came to the UK and played some memorable shows, including 4 sold-out nights at the Speakeasy and live on BBC's TV rock show The Old Grey Whistle Test. They also toured the States for the first time, supporting a young Bruce Springsteen at Max's Kansas City in New York and opening for Sly and the Family Stone. So exciting was the band now becoming as a live act that after 4 dates, they were thrown off the tour. Stranded in Las Vegas, the group then landed 2 nights in a San Francisco club, The Matrix. Both shows sold out, the response ecstatic. 2 more dates were slotted in and the Wailers were also asked to perform live in the studio for hip radio station KSAN. It turned out to be a classic performance, the group mixing songs from Catch a Fire with material from their soon-to-be-released LP, Burning, plus a scorching star turn from Peter Tosh on You Can't Blame the Youth. Their reputation was spreading. It seemed that after years of struggling, the Wailers' time was finally about to come.
Selassie I is the king of kings. On earth, no, which guy on earth rich like the king of kings?
But within the ranks of the Wailers, all was not well. Their second album for Ireland, Burning, was issued towards the end of 1973. It was a much more organic affair, rootsier and more outspoken than its predecessor, with the back sleeve sporting a photograph of Bob smoking a humongous spliff. There was a more overt political and social message as typified by songs like Burnin' and Lootin', and by the uplifting opener, Get Up, Stand Up, an anthem later adopted by the Amnesty International organisation. But Marley was smart enough to leaven his Jamaican patois with enough English to get his points across. Sadly, it was the last album to feature all 3 original Wailers. Bunny had decided that he didn't like touring and the problems it brought with it: cold weather, lack of ganja. His place on the 1973 US tour was taken by their old pal Joe Higgs. Livingston, now rechristened Bunny Wailer, would retire to his farm in Bull Bay and enjoy a long, if sporadic, solo career, releasing such fine albums as Black Heart Man. Peter Tosh's split was more rancorous. Peter believed that the group was a democracy, all 3 members of the front line of equal importance. He resented the way the group was now being marketed as Bob Marley and the Wailers, pointing the finger at Chris Blackwell as the main instigator of this. Though, if truth was told, Lee Perry had already issued material under that name some years before. A giant of a man, Tosh had an attitude and mouth to match and refused to languish in Bob's shadow. He left the band in 1974 and embarked on a solo career that saw him continue to speak out against what he and Bob called the shitstorm. He released a number of angry, articulate albums and for a while fell in with the Rolling Stones. Sadly, he was killed in a brutal shooting in September 1987. After they left, Marley swiftly revamped the band, bringing in Rita and Marcia permanently, together with Judy Mowat as backing singers, whom he named the I-Threes. He also added guitarists Junior Marvin from Ladbroke Grove and Al Anderson from the New York art scene. His career was also given an unexpected boost by British blues guitarist Eric Clapton. In the wake of huge success with bands like Cream and Derek and the Dominos, Clapton had suffered ill health and was slowly putting his life back together, recording in Miami. He was laying down tracks for what would become 461 Ocean Boulevard. Fellow guitarist George Terry was a fan of Burnin' and turned Eric on to the sensuous pleasures of its grooves. Clapton was particularly taken by I Shot the Sheriff and decided to cover it for the album. He found the rhythm a little difficult to get to grips with, having played the more straightforward blues most of his life, but eventually completed a credible version of the number. The song was later released as a single and enjoyed top 10 status on both sides of the Atlantic. It was a sure sign that Marley's star was rising as one of the greats of the 1970s music scene. He meanwhile released the Natty Dread album, the first without his boyhood pals Peter and Bunny. Natty Dread was as fiercely committed as its predecessors. Marley's passionate songs touched on poverty, pain, love and revolution, and were liberally peppered with his strong Rasta vision. It appealed to a new generation of black youth looking for hope, and Marley became an icon for them. Equally important was that it was the record to finally break him in the UK. In the summer of '75, the group played 2 shows at the Lyceum on London's Strand. They were magical tribal occasions uniting young black and white Britons for the first time. Marley sensed his true power, and the audiences crowding the Victorian dance hall would have done anything he commanded them to do. The majesty, energy and sheer good vibes of these performances were captured on the live album. This was crowned by a subliminal version of No Woman No Cry from Natty Dread. Both the live album and a single of No Woman stormed the UK charts. The crossover had begun. Bob Marley and the Wailers were finally heading for the mainstream.